Do you believe history is always written by the victors? Get ready to question that belief. Today, we're diving into the saga of a man whose name should resonate with the same force as the greatest conquerors, yet paradoxically, he's overshadowed by his own son. We're talking about Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian, a figure who, long before Hannibal marched over the Alps, was already defying Roman supremacy and forging the foundations for the greatest rivalry of antiquity. Many think the Punic fury began and ended with Hannibal, but what if I told you the true mastermind behind the eternal opposition to Rome was his father, a strategist as brilliant as he was ruthless? This script will reveal how Hamilcar, emerging from the shadows of Carthaginian defeat and a brutal civil war with mercenaries, not only saved his city from annihilation but rebuilt it from the ashes, forging an empire in Hispania with the silver from its mines and the blood of its warriors. You'll discover how he planted the seed of hatred and vengeance in the heart of his young son Hannibal, setting the stage for what would become history's most epic and bloody confrontation. If you're surprised, if you feel the injustice of a story half told, or if you simply love seeing the missing link between great events, then leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so more people can uncover this forgotten legend. After all, spreading knowledge is the greatest reward. And where are you watching this epic journey from? Tell us in the comments. In the 3rd century BCE, the Mediterranean was not a sea of peace, but a cauldron of ambition and power, teeming with the aspirations of two colossal civilizations. On one side, the Roman Republic, with its implacable legions and an insatiable thirst for expansion, emerged from the Italian peninsula, consolidating its dominion over neighboring peoples. Its eyes, once fixed on dry land, began to turn towards the vast blue, towards the maritime routes that connected the known world. Rome, once a humble city-state, now stood on the threshold of an empire, and its dizzying ascent brought with it an implacable certainty. Collision was inevitable. On the other side, imposing itself on the North African coast, stood Carthage, the jewel of the Punic Empire. A city-state of Phoenician origin, Carthage was, above all, a maritime and commercial power. Its fleets dominated the waves. Its merchants wove a vast trade network that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules, Strait of Gibraltar, to the eastern coasts of the Mediterranean. It was a metropolis of incalculable wealth, with bustling ports, vibrant markets, and a mercantile oligarchy that saw the sea not only as a livelihood, but as the very essence of its existence. For centuries, Carthage had reigned almost unopposed over trade routes, and its warships ensured the security of its merchant fleets and its strategic possessions, such as Sicily, Sardinia, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Gold and silver flowed into its coffers, sustaining an army of loyal mercenaries and an enviable urban infrastructure. This was the scenario of Titans, where Rome's territorial expansion directly clashed with Carthage's maritime hegemony. Sicily, a rich and strategic island in the heart of the Mediterranean, became the focal point of this growing tension. For Rome, controlling Sicily meant security and agricultural expansion. For Carthage, it was the safeguard of its trade routes and its influence. The island was a powder keg, and the smallest spark could ignite a conflict of unimaginable proportions, which would decide which of the two powers would govern the future of the Western world. Amidst this impending catastrophe, the figure of a young and ambitious Carthaginian general began to emerge, Hamilcar Barca. He would be not only a participant, but one of the main architects of the Punic resistance, a man whose life would become synonymous with Carthage's desperate struggle for survival against the Roman giant. Carthage, or Carthage, New City, as it was known in Phoenician, was not just a city. It was the head of a vast maritime empire that, at its peak, encompassed an intricate network of city-states, colonies, and trading posts. Founded by Phoenicians from Tyre, according to tradition, in the 9th century BCE, its strategic location on the North African coast, near modern Tunis, was enviable. The city controlled a vast and fertile agricultural hinterland, but its true strength lay in its naval and commercial capabilities. The Phoenicians, master navigators and merchants, had passed on their legacy to Carthage, which elevated it to a new level of sophistication and scale. The Carthaginian economy was a model of diversification. In addition to intensive agriculture in its fertile lands, which supplied abundant grains, olive oil, and wine. Carthage prospered from the trade of luxury goods, metals, silver from Hispania, tin from Britannia, textiles, ceramics, and manufactured goods. Its trade routes extended throughout the western Mediterranean, with colonies and trading posts in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, Hispania, and along the North African coast. The oligarchy that governed Carthage was composed of aristocratic families enriched by trade and land ownership, and these families exerted tight control over the city's affairs, prioritizing mercantile interests. Militarily, Carthage relied heavily on an army of mercenaries, recruited from various ethnic groups and regions: Libyans, Numidians, light and fast cavalry, Iberians, heavy infantry, Celts, and Greeks. While this dependence on foreign troops could be a vulnerability in times of internal crisis, in times of prosperity, it allowed Carthage to maintain considerable military power without the need for vast conscription of its own citizens, who preferred to dedicate themselves to trade and the arts. The Carthaginian navy, however, was exceptional and composed mainly of citizens. Its quinqueremes, warships with 5 banks of oars, were the backbone of its naval hegemony, protecting its merchant fleets and ensuring control of vital maritime routes. Religion also played a central role in Carthaginian society. Phoenician deities like Baal Hammon and Tanit were worshipped with great fervor, and sacrifices at times included human offerings and rituals that today seem grim to us, but which were considered essential to ensure the city's prosperity and protection by the Carthaginians. This was Carthage, a mercantilist, navally superior, wealthy power with a distinct culture, which had prospered for centuries in a precarious balance of power with other regional powers, until the shadow of Rome began to extend over its spheres of influence. The rise of Rome and the consolidation of its power on the Italian peninsula inevitably put it on a collision course with Carthaginian hegemony. Initially, relations between the two powers were more about coexistence and even strategic alliance, especially against common threats, such as the Greeks in southern Italy and Sicily. Treaties were signed throughout the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, outlining spheres of influence and regulating trade. However, these agreements were fragile, built on a foundation of mutual convenience that would deteriorate as the ambitions of both parties grew exponentially. Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, was the focal point of this growing tension. Geographically, the island was a natural bridge between Italy and Africa, and its fertility made it a valuable prize. For Carthage, Sicily was vital to protect its trade routes eastward and maintain its influence over the western Mediterranean. They already held several fortresses and cities in the western part of the island, although the east was dominated by Greek city-states, notably Syracuse. For Rome, Sicily represented a potential threat in its immediate vicinity. Having such a strong foreign power a few kilometers from its coasts was unacceptable, especially as Rome expanded its agriculture and needed new fertile lands. The Greek cities of Sicily, often in conflict with each other or with Carthage, sought the support of external powers. Syracuse, in particular, was an important player, constantly shifting alliances to maintain its autonomy. Rome's intervention in southern Italy, where Greek city-states had requested its protection against invaders, and at times against the Carthaginians themselves, had already led Rome to become familiar with Sicilian affairs. The growing Roman presence in the Strait of Messina, which separates Sicily from Italy, was a clear sign of its expansionist ambitions. Commercial disputes were also a source of friction. Carthage, with its policy of closed seas in certain regions, imposed restrictions on the trade of other powers, including the Romans, who saw this as an impediment to their own economic expansion. The wealth generated by controlling maritime routes was a coveted prize, and Rome, with its agrarian economy and its newfound naval vocation, began to question Carthaginian supremacy in the seas. The issue of Messina, a city in Sicily controlled by Campanian mercenaries known as the Mamertines, was the spark. Besieged by Hierosank of Syracuse and under threat from Carthage, the Mamertines made a desperate plea for help to Rome. This request, seemingly trivial, was actually a bait for Rome to intervene directly in Sicily. The Roman Senate hesitated, aware of the implications of violating old treaties. and starting a conflict with such a formidable naval power as Carthage. However, the prospect of territorial and strategic gains, and the fear of seeing Carthage consolidate its power over all of Sicily, were powerful arguments. The final decision to send troops to Messana, despite the risks, sealed the fate of the two greatest powers in the Mediterranean and initiated the First Punic War, a conflict that would redefine the map of the ancient world. The city of Messana, strategically located on the strait separating Sicily from the Italian peninsula, became the ignition point for a conflict that would consume 2 generations and alter the course of history. It wasn't Messana's original citizens who sought Roman protection, but a group of Campanian mercenaries, the Mamertines, or Sons of Mars, who had seized the city by force years earlier after serving Syracuse. In 265 BCE, facing a siege by the ambitious Hero II of Syracuse, the Mamertines found themselves at a desperate crossroads. Divided, some sought Carthage's protection, allowing a Punic garrison to occupy the citadel. Others, distrustful of Carthaginian intentions, sent an urgent plea for help to Rome. The Roman Republic faced a moral and strategic dilemma. Intervening in Messana would mean violating previous treaties with Carthage, and more importantly, risking a large-scale war against a superior naval power. However, the temptation was great. Secure a foothold in Sicily, prevent Carthage from controlling the entire strait, and perhaps open the way for Roman expansion beyond Italy. The Roman Senate, initially hesitant and morally divided, was swayed by the popular assembly, which saw the opportunity for gain and glory. The final decision was to send an army. In 264 BCE, Roman legions under the command of Consul Appius Claudius Caudex crossed the Strait of Messana, a daring act that Carthage considered a flagrant violation of its sphere of influence. Upon arrival, they found the city divided between the pro-Carthaginian and pro-Roman factions. The Carthaginian garrison, under Admiral Hanno, initially retreated, perhaps underestimating Roman determination or awaiting reinforcements. However, upon realizing Rome's intent to establish a permanent presence, Carthage reacted vigorously. The outbreak of conflict was swift and brutal. Carthage, allied with Syracuse, ironically, against whom the Mamertines had sought help, besieged Messana. Rome, in turn, defended its new allies and repelled the attacks. Initial fighting in Sicily demonstrated the Roman legion's land superiority. The Carthaginians, although they had a strong presence on the island, were unprepared for the scale and intensity of the Roman response. Hero II of Syracuse, recognizing Roman strength and the ineffectiveness of the alliance with Carthage, quickly switched sides, signing a peace treaty with Rome in 263 BCE and becoming a valuable ally. This event marked the end of peace and the beginning of one of antiquity's longest and bloodiest series of wars, the Punic Wars. Rome, an essentially land-based power, was now forced to venture into a domain that Carthage had perfected for centuries, the sea. The struggle for Messana, which initially seemed a local dispute, quickly escalated into a total war for control of the Mediterranean, a struggle that would define who would be the master of the known world. The stage was set for a clash of titans, and the outbreak of war in 264 BCE was the first step in an epic journey of sacrifice, glory, and ruin. Rome's entry into the First Punic War exposed its greatest vulnerability, the lack of a navy comparable to Carthage's. While the Punics were master navigators and shipbuilders, with centuries of experience in maritime trade and naval warfare, the Romans were, in essence, a land-based people whose strength lay in their invincible legions. At the beginning of the conflict, the few Roman fleets consisted mainly of transport ships or small coastal squadrons, inadequate to face the powerful Carthaginian quinqueremes. Sicily, the central stage of the conflict, could not be conquered without control of the seas. The technological and experiential gap was immense. Carthage had a numerous and well-trained fleet, with fast and maneuverable ships, designed for ramming tactics, where the reinforced bow of the ship collided with the enemy's flank to sink it. The Romans, on the other hand, lacked adequate warships and the necessary expertise to operate them on a large scale. However, Roman ingenuity and determination, combined with their ability to mobilize vast human and material resources, soon proved to be a decisive factor. The most widespread legend, though not entirely proven, tells that the Romans captured a Carthaginian quinquereme stranded or shipwrecked on the Italian coast. This ship, dismantled and studied, served as a model for the construction of an entire fleet. In a Herculean effort of engineering and logistics, Rome built over 100 quinqueremes in record time. Some accounts speak of just 60 days. This demonstrated the impressive Roman capacity for organization and adaptation. However, replicating a ship was not enough. The Romans knew they could not compete with Carthaginian naval expertise in ramming maneuvers. It was then that an ingenious invention, perhaps the most important in ancient naval warfare for Rome, emerged: the corvus. The corvus was a boarding bridge with a heavy hook at the end, which could be lowered onto the deck of an enemy ship. Once the hook was fixed, Roman legions could cross the bridge, transforming a naval battle into a land battle, where their infantry superiority was undeniable. The first test for the new Roman fleet and its corvus came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE. Consul Gaius Duilius led the Roman fleet against the Carthaginian squadron. The Carthaginians, confident in their superiority and Roman inexperience, approached to ram. To their surprise and despair, they were confronted with the corvus. The tactic worked with devastating effectiveness. Many Carthaginian ships were boarded, their crews slaughtered or captured, and the ships seized. The Roman victory at Mylae was resounding, and Duilius was awarded the first naval triumph in Rome's history. This battle not only marked Rome's first major naval victory, but also broke the myth of Carthaginian invincibility at sea. Rome proved that it could not only build a fleet, but also innovate tactically to overcome its enemies. Roman naval dominance, which would solidify throughout the war, was a crucial factor that surprised Carthage and paved the way for the eventual Roman victory, demonstrating that adaptability and resilience could overcome even centuries of experience. When Hamilcar Barca ascended to command Carthaginian forces in Sicily in 247 BCE, the First Punic War had already dragged on for 17 years. The situation for Carthage was bleak. Land campaigns on the island had largely failed. Hiero Secund of Syracuse, Carthage's initial ally, had defected to Rome. The Carthaginian fleet, once invincible, had suffered significant setbacks, and Rome's corvus strategy had leveled the naval playing field. Most of Sicily was under Roman control, with Carthage retaining only a handful of fortified cities in the west of the island, such as Lilybaeum, modern Marsala, and Drepana, modern Trapani, which were enduring prolonged sieges. The morale of the Carthaginian troops was shattered. The mercenaries, the backbone of the Punic army, were discontent with payment delays and constant defeats. Carthage's oligarchy, focused on its commercial interests and already financially exhausted by the long war, was reluctant to send significant reinforcements and resources. Many in Carthage already considered the war lost and sought peace, however costly. It was in this scenario of despair and disillusionment that Hamilcar, a young general from an aristocratic family, assumed leadership. Hamilcar was no ordinary commander. He refused to resign himself to defeat and possessed a strategic vision and energy that many of his predecessors lacked. His first major action was to establish a fortified base on Mount Ercte, modern Monte Pellegrino near Palermo, a difficult-to-access location with steep cliffs and caves. From there, he launched a series of audacious attacks against Roman supply lines and coastal cities. He had no intention of confronting Roman legions in open-pitched battles, a tactic that had already proven disastrous for Carthage, but rather to wear them down, intercept their convoys, and maintain constant pressure. His methods were innovative and relentless. Using small, rapid assault groups, Hamilcar conducted lightning raids, causing destruction and returning to his fortress before the Romans could react effectively. He employed a combination of guerrilla tactics and attrition warfare, which confused and frustrated Roman generals, accustomed to direct large-scale confrontations. In addition to his land attacks, Hamilcar also commanded small naval squadrons that raided the Italian coasts, spreading terror and forcing Rome to divert resources to defend its own territory. Despite limited resources, Hamilcar managed to maintain a cohesive and motivated force. He inspired loyalty in his men, and demonstrated an exceptional capacity for leadership. His arrival marked a shift in the dynamic of the war in Sicily. He not only prevented the complete collapse of Carthaginian forces, but also managed to revitalize the spirit of resistance. Hamilcar Barca was not just a general, he was a symbol of hope for Carthage in a moment of profound crisis. A strategist who, against all odds, would attempt to reverse the course of a seemingly lost war. His entry onto the scene in 247 BCE was the prelude to a phase of intense and innovative combat. In the agony of the First Punic War, Sicily, with its rugged geography, steep mountains, and deep valleys, offered ideal terrain for guerrilla warfare, a tactic that Hamilcar Barca mastered with exceptional skill. While the Romans preferred open field battles, where the strength and discipline of their legions could be fully exploited, Hamilcar understood that the key to survival and inflicting damage on the enemy lay in avoiding direct confrontations and using the environment to his advantage. This was the strategy of a commander who, though inferior in numbers and resources, possessed acute tactical intelligence and a deep understanding of irregular warfare. Upon assuming command in 247 BCE, Hamilcar established his main base on Mount Ercte, Monte Pellegrino, an isolated and difficult-to-access mountain near modern Palermo. This natural fortress was practically impenetrable, with panoramic views of the sea and land routes. The position allowed Hamilcar to monitor Roman movements and launch surprise attacks with great effectiveness. He built fortifications and storehouses, transforming the mount into a self-sustaining stronghold from which he could operate for long periods. From Ercte, and later from Mount Eryx, near Drepana, Hamilcar led swift and violent raids. His tactic consisted of ambushing Roman supply convoys, attacking small garrisons, and plundering Roman allied territory in Sicily. These attacks were not aimed at permanent territorial conquest, but rather at the continuous attrition of the enemy. He sought to demoralize the legions, undermine their logistics, and force Rome to keep a large number of troops immobilized in defensive tasks, far from decisive engagements. Hamilcar used speed and surprise as his main weapons. His mercenaries, especially the Numidian cavalry and light infantry, were trained for rapid movements through difficult terrain. They would appear suddenly, strike furiously, and disappear as quickly as they emerged, giving the Romans no chance to organize an effective counteroffensive. This war of attrition was exhausting for the legions, who found themselves constantly on guard, fighting an elusive enemy that seemed to emerge from nowhere and vanish into thin air. In addition to land operations, Hamilcar also employed his small fleet to conduct amphibious attacks against the Italian coasts, especially Bruttium, modern Calabria. These raids, though limited in scope, had significant psychological impact. They showed the vulnerability of Roman territory and forced the consuls to keep troops in Italy for defense, rather than sending them to Sicily. Hamilcar understood that war was not just a matter of pitched battles, but also of resource and morale exhaustion. Hamilcar's guerrilla tactics not only kept the flame of Carthaginian resistance alive in Sicily, but also demonstrated a versatility and adaptability that would become a hallmark of his family. He proved that, even in the face of an enemy superior in number and resources, an ingenious commander could impose a prohibitive cost on the adversary. The mountains of Sicily, under Hamilcar's command, became a deadly labyrinth for the Romans, a testament to the tactical genius of a general who refused to accept defeat. After years of operations on Mount Ercte, Hamilcar Barca realized the need for a base closer to the main Carthaginian strongholds in Sicily, and, at the same time, one that offered new opportunities to harass the Romans. In 244 BCE, he moved his operations to Mount Eryx, modern Eris, a sacred and fortified mountain located a few kilometers from Drepana, one of Carthage's last and most important fortresses in Sicily, which was already under Roman siege. This strategic shift demonstrated Hamilcar's ability to adapt and seize the initiative, even in a war of attrition. Mount Eryx, with its imposing location and the sanctuary dedicated to Aphrodite Erycina, equivalent to the Punic Astarte, was a site of great symbolic and strategic significance. Hamilcar not only consolidated a robust defensive position, but also launched continuous attacks against the Roman forces besieging Drepana and Lilybaeum. His presence on Eryx created a constant threat to the Roman rear and complicated the concentration of troops and supplies for the sieges. Hamilcar's audacity was evident in every move. He was not content to merely defend positions. He actively sought confrontation on his own terms. His attacks were precise and unexpected. Using his light infantry and Numidian cavalry, he conducted lightning raids, intercepting convoys, ambushing patrols, and assaulting Roman outposts. These swift blows, followed by a retreat to the safety of his mountain positions, undermined the legion's morale and caused immense frustration among Roman commanders. They found themselves constantly reacting to an elusive enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The situation in Drepana was particularly critical. The city, a vital port for Carthage, was under prolonged siege, and its fall would mean the end of Carthaginian presence in Sicily. Hamilcar, operating from Eryx, did his utmost to relieve pressure on Drepana, launching coordinated attacks with the besieged garrison, or distracting Roman forces with movements in other directions. His objective was not necessarily to break the siege, but rather to make the Roman campaign as costly and prolonged as possible. In addition to land operations, Hamilcar continued to send small fleets to raid the Italian coast. These amphibious incursions, though limited in scope, were psychologically effective. They demonstrated the vulnerability of Roman territory and forced the consuls to keep troops in Italy for defense, rather than sending them to Sicily. Hamilcar understood that war was not just a matter of pitched battles, but also of resource and morale exhaustion. The operations at Eryx and Drepana illustrate Hamilcar Barca's resilience and tactical genius. He transformed a desperate command situation into a source of constant threat to Rome. Even with a rebuilt and increasingly strong Roman navy, and with Carthage's resources dwindling, Hamilcar managed to keep the flame of Punic resistance alive, inflicting significant losses on the enemy and prolonging the war unexpectedly. His presence on Eryx became a thorn in Rome's side, a symbol of Carthaginian stubbornness in a war that already seemed lost. Hamilcar Barca's inflexibility in the face of adversity was not merely a personal trait. It was a characteristic that distinguished him and elevated him above many of his contemporaries. During a period when the Carthaginian elite showed war weariness and an increasing inclination to negotiate peace at any cost, Hamilcar maintained an uncompromising stance, an iron determination to continue the fight against Rome. This attitude at times bordered on stubbornness, but it was, at the same time, the sole reason why Carthaginian resistance in Sicily endured for so many years against an overwhelmingly superior enemy. When he assumed command in 247 BCE, the main Carthaginian cities in Sicily, Lilybaeum and Drepana, were under relentless siege by the Romans. The Carthaginian fleet had been decimated in several naval battles, and reinforcements from Carthage were scarce and irregular, reflecting the economic exhaustion and disinterest of a faction of the mercantile oligarchy. Even in the face of the Roman legion's numerical superiority and Rome's almost complete naval hegemony, Hamilcar did not consider surrender an option. His refusal to yield was not irrational. It was based on a deep strategic conviction. Hamilcar believed that as long as Carthage maintained a force in the field, especially in Sicily, Rome would be forced to continue investing resources and men in the war, incurring costs that, ultimately, could become unsustainable. He understood that war was a game of attrition, and that persistence, even on a small scale, could exhaust the adversary. This inflexibility manifested in his daily leadership. He demanded strict discipline from his troops, but also inspired loyalty through his own example of courage and dedication. Hamilcar was a commander who shared the hardships of his men, fought alongside them, and showed them respect, something uncommon in mercenary armies. His soldiers, despite precarious conditions and the constant threat of death, remained loyal to him. The legend of his stance regarding the peace proposed by Rome is particularly revealing. After the Carthaginian defeat at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, 241 BCE, the situation became untenable. The Carthaginian government, with no options left and its navy annihilated, instructed Hamilcar to negotiate peace with the Roman consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus. According to some sources, Hamilcar refused to do so personally. as he did not want to sign a treaty that would seal his city's defeat. He reportedly left the task to one of his subordinates, Gisgo, demonstrating his repudiation of the idea of capitulation. While this refusal might be seen as an act of pride, it also reflects his conviction that Carthage could have still fought, or that peace was unacceptably humiliating. Hamilcar's inflexibility, while it did not prevent Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War, was crucial in prolonging the war and inspiring a generation. It cemented his reputation as an indomitable commander and an unyielding patriot. More than that, this characteristic would be passed down to his son Hannibal, who would inherit not only his father's tactical genius, but also his unbreakable determination to defy Rome's power, no matter the cost. After years of attrition in Sicily, where Hamilcar Barca brilliantly maintained Carthaginian resistance, the fate of the First Punic War would be sealed not on land, but at sea. The Battle of the Aegates Islands, fought on March 10, 241 BCE, was the naval confrontation that finally broke the backbone of Carthaginian power and forced Carthage to accept defeat. Carthage's situation was rapidly deteriorating. Resources were exhausted, and the public treasury could no longer fund the large-scale war. The mercantile oligarchy, weary of the costs and losses, yearned for an end to the conflict. Rome, in turn, though also exhausted, demonstrated remarkable resilience. In a desperate final effort, the Roman Senate decided to build a new fleet, financed by patriotic loans from wealthy citizens. This fleet, consisting of about 200 newly built quinqueremes, was placed under the command of Consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus. Rome had learned from its mistakes and improved its naval techniques, abandoning the corvus in favor of faster, more maneuverable ships and training its crews exhaustively. Carthage, in response, gathered what remained of its navy, about 250 ships, many of them transport vessels loaded with supplies for Hamilcar's troops in Sicily, and with less experienced crews than before. Command of this fleet was given to Hanno the Great, who was not an experienced sailor. The Carthaginian objective was simple: break the Roman blockade and resupply the besieged garrisons in Sicily. The clash occurred near the Aegates Islands, west of Sicily. Consul Catulus, aware of the importance of victory, positioned his fleet to intercept the Carthaginians. The battle was a massacre for Carthage. The Roman ships, more agile and with superior crews, maneuvered with precision. The ramming tactic, once a Carthaginian specialty, was mastered by the Romans. Furthermore, the Roman capacity for boarding and hand-to-hand combat, which had been honed since Mylae, ensured that any Carthaginian ship not rammed could be boarded and taken. The consequences were catastrophic for Carthage. Polybius, the Greek historian, reports that about 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk and 70 were captured, while Roman losses were minimal. Many Carthaginian soldiers and sailors were killed or taken prisoner. The Carthaginian fleet was annihilated, and with it, any hope of resupplying its forces in Sicily or controlling the sea. The defeat at the Aegates Islands was the final blow in the First Punic War. Without a navy to support its troops in Sicily, and with its last strongholds besieged and exhausted, Carthage had no choice but to sue for peace. The Carthaginian government sent Hamilcar Barca, the general who had resisted for years, to negotiate with Catulus. Although Hamilcar, according to accounts, refused to personally sign the peace treaty due to his reluctance to accept such a humiliating defeat, he played a crucial role in negotiating the terms. The resulting treaty, the Treaty of Lutatius, imposed severe sanctions on Carthage, including the payment of a heavy war indemnity and the loss of all its possessions in Sicily. The First Punic War had ended, and Rome emerged as the undisputed naval and land power in the Western Mediterranean, leaving Carthage with only humiliation and the desire for revenge. The catastrophic defeat at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE left Carthage with no option but to capitulate. The Carthaginian elite, exhausted by more than 2 decades of war and with empty coffers, instructed Hamilcar Barca, the general who had never surrendered on the battlefield, to negotiate the terms of peace with the Roman consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus. Hamilcar, however, deeply humiliated by the necessity of submitting to Rome, is said to have refused to personally sign the treaty, leaving the task to Gisgo, his subordinate. This reluctance already foreshadowed the bitter resentment Carthage would harbor towards Rome. The treaty, known as the Treaty of Lutatius, was brutal and aimed not only to punish Carthage for having challenged Rome, but also to weaken its ability to resume war in the future. Its conditions were as follows: cession of Sicily and adjacent islands. Carthage was forced to renounce all its possessions in Sicily. The island, which had been the primary bone of contention and the stage for much of the fighting, became Rome's first province. Furthermore, nearby islands, such as the Aegates Islands and the Lipari Islands, were also ceded to Rome. This clause meant the loss of vast fertile lands and control of crucial maritime routes in the central Mediterranean. Heavy war indemnity. Perhaps the most onerous condition, Carthage was obligated to pay Rome an exorbitant war indemnity. Originally, the amount was 2,200 talents of silver, about 57 tons, to be paid over 20 years. However, the Roman Senate, feeling the terms were too lenient, soon tightened them. The amount was increased to 3,200 talents, approximately 83 tons, and the payment period was reduced to just 10 years. This colossal indemnity represented an almost unbearable financial burden for a city already devastated by war, leading it into a deep economic crisis. Release of prisoners without ransom. Carthage had to release all Roman prisoners of war without demanding any ransom. In contrast, the Carthaginians needed to pay a ransom to recover their own captives. This disparity not only represented an additional financial loss, but also a public humiliation. Prohibition of attacking Roman allies. Carthage was forbidden from waging war against Rome's allies in the future, which significantly restricted its foreign policy and its ability to protect its interests without Rome's approval. The consequences of this treaty were profound and lasting. The loss of Sicily deprived Carthage of one of its main sources of food and recruitment, in addition to dismantling its strategic position in the central Mediterranean. The war indemnity stifled the Carthaginian economy, making immediate recovery impossible. To raise the necessary money, Carthage had to heavily tax its own citizens and, later, seek new sources of wealth, which would lead to its expansion into Hispania under the command of Hamilcar Barca. More than the material losses, the treaty inflicted a deep wound on Carthaginian pride. The humiliation of being forced to accept such terms generated lasting resentment and a burning desire for revenge in many sectors of Carthaginian society, especially in the Barca family. This peace agreement, far from resolving tensions, only postponed and deepened them, paving the way for an even larger and bloodier conflict in the future, the Second Punic War. The peace of 241 BCE was, in truth, merely a temporary truce. The defeat in the First Punic War and the harsh conditions of the Treaty of Lutatius had immediate and disastrous consequences for Carthage, culminating in one of the most existential crises in its history, the Mercenary War. The first and most urgent problem arose with the return of the vast contingents of mercenaries who had fought for the city in Sicily and on other fronts. These soldiers from various ethnic backgrounds, Libyans, Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, Greeks, were the backbone of the Carthaginian army. They had fought for years in difficult conditions, many of them without seeing their families for long periods. Now, with the war over, they expected to be paid in full as agreed. The Carthaginian tradition was to gather the mercenaries after a war, pay them their overdue wages, and demobilize them. However, Carthage's financial situation was in ruins. The war indemnity to Rome was a colossal sum, and the city's coffers were empty. As the mercenaries began to return to Africa, they were initially quartered in the city of Sika, modern El Kef, Tunisia, about 100 kilometers from Carthage. The Carthaginian government, in an attempt to prevent such a large mass of armed and potentially discontented men from gathering near the capital, asked them to wait there while payments were prepared. However, this measure only served to escalate tensions. The mercenaries, frustrated by the delay and suspicious of the government's intentions, began to demand not only overdue pay but also the promised money for transportation back to their homelands, and even additional payments as compensation for unfulfilled plunder. The situation was exacerbated by the mismanagement and arrogance of some Carthaginian officials, such as Hanno the Great, who tried to negotiate even more unfavorable terms for the mercenaries, offering them only a fraction of what they were owed, and in terms that were insulting to veteran warriors. Hanno, who had been a political rival of Hamilcar Barca and was not popular among the troops, lacked Hamilcar's skill in dealing with soldiers and managing crises. His proposals only further inflamed their spirits. Tension quickly escalated into revolt. Unpaid and feeling betrayed and disrespected, the mercenaries, estimated at around 20,000 men, marched towards Carthage, encamping near the city of Tunes, a few kilometers from the capital. Their leaders, the Libyan Spendius and the Campanian Matho, a former Roman slave which showed the group's diversity, emerged as charismatic figures, capitalizing on the widespread resentment. The cry for justice quickly turned into a desire for revenge against Carthage, which they saw as exploitative and ungrateful. The revolt was not limited to foreign mercenaries. Quickly, the Libyan population subjugated by Carthage, who had long suffered under Punic taxation and exploitation, saw the mercenary rebellion as an opportunity to free themselves. Entire villages rose up, joining the rebels, and financial and supply contributions from the Libyans added fuel to the fire of the insurrection. Libyan women, who had been forced to pay high taxes on their children, donated their ornaments to fund the war against Carthage. The extent of the revolt was alarming. All coastal African cities under Carthaginian rule, except Utica and Hippodiaritis, modern Bizerte, joined the rebellion, becoming bases for the mercenaries and providing them with resources and manpower. Carthage itself, now besieged by land, saw its supply routes cut, its fields plundered, and its population in panic. The situation was critical. The city, which had just emerged from a devastating war against Rome, now faced a brutal civil war on its own territory, fought by those who had once defended it. The payment crisis that ignited the mercenary war was not merely a bureaucratic delay. It was the result of a perfect storm of economic and political factors that befell Carthage after the First Punic War. The city, which once boasted fabulous riches, now staggered under the weight of its war obligations. Firstly, the war indemnity imposed by Rome was astronomically high. The 3,200 talents of silver to be paid in just 10 years represented a continuous and massive drain on Carthage's coffers. To give an idea, a talent of silver was a considerable unit of weight, and this sum represented the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in current values, an immense financial burden for any state of the time. Secondly, the loss of Sicily and other strategic islands deprived Carthage of vast sources of revenue. Sicily was not just a military base. It was an extremely fertile agricultural region that produced abundant grains and generated significant taxes. With the loss of these territories, Carthage's ability to raise funds and provide supplies for its army was severely compromised. Third, the very duration of the First Punic War had exhausted Carthage's resources. 2 decades of conflict had cost enormous sums in ships, supplies, and above all in paying a vast mercenary army. Even before the final defeat, the Carthaginian economy already showed signs of stress. In this scenario of financial exhaustion, the arrival of tens of thousands of mercenaries demanding their overdue wages, which had accumulated for several months, in some cases up to a year, was a ticking time bomb. The Carthaginian government, perhaps in a desperate effort to buy time or due to sheer mismanagement, tried to negotiate with the mercenaries. Initially, the idea was to settle the payments in installments, or even to convince the mercenaries to accept less than what they were owed. The conduct of these negotiations was disastrous. Hanno the Great, who was in charge of the task, lacked the tact or military experience to deal with such a volatile contingent. He was a representative of the more conservative aristocratic faction, who prioritized fiscal austerity and had no empathy for the soldiers' needs. Instead of appeasing the mercenaries, his arrogant proposals and insistence on reducing payments only served to further inflame their anger and distrust. Negotiations dragged on, delays accumulated, and the mercenaries' frustration turned into fury. The mercenary leaders, such as Spendius and Matho, knew how to exploit this dissatisfaction. They argued that Carthage, which had exploited their services and benefited from their blood, was now abandoning them and stealing what was owed to them. This perception of injustice, combined with the desperate financial need of the soldiers, many of whom depended on these payments to support their families, fueled the rebellion. Carthage's inability to honor its debts was not merely an administrative failure. It was a strategic failure with catastrophic consequences. The city had invested heavily in these mercenaries during years of war, and now, by refusing to pay them in full, it turned its own defenders into its most dangerous enemies. The payment crisis became the catalyst for a brutal civil war, which threatened to wipe Carthage off the map and would require a leader of exceptional ability to contain. The tension that had been building in Sicca and later in Tunes exploded into a revolt of unprecedented proportions, initiating the Mercenary War, a conflict that Polybius, the Greek historian, described as the truceless war, a war that could not be forgotten due to its ferocity and cruelty. In 241 BCE, barely had peace with Rome been formalized when Carthage found itself plunged into an internal nightmare. The spark that ignited the fire was Hanno the Great's intransigence in his negotiations with the mercenaries. His attempts to cut payments and impose humiliating terms drove the soldiers to the brink of insurrection. The frustration with delays, the feeling of betrayal, and the perception that their lives were being disregarded by the Carthaginian elite reached a boiling point. The mercenaries, who expected to be received as heroes and paid for their years of service, now felt like unwanted outcasts. The decisive moment came when the mercenaries, instead of dispersing peacefully, marched en masse towards Carthage. They encamped in Tunes, a city just 15 kilometers from the capital, from where they could directly threaten the Punic metropolis. Leadership of the revolt was quickly assumed by two charismatic figures: Spendius, a former Campanian slave who had fled from Rome and was a deserter, and Matho, a Libyan who had served as a mercenary in Carthage. Spendius, with his Roman past, harbored a particular hatred for the established order, and Matho mobilized the resentment of the oppressed Libyan populations against Carthaginian taxes. The revolt was not limited to foreign mercenaries. Quickly, the Libyan population subjugated by Carthage, who had long suffered under Punic taxation and exploitation, saw the mercenary rebellion as an opportunity for liberation. Entire villages rose up, joining the rebels, and financial and supply contributions from the Libyans added fuel to the fire of the insurrection. Libyan women, who had been forced to pay high taxes on their children, donated their ornaments to fund the war against Carthage. The extent of the revolt was alarming. All coastal African cities under Carthaginian rule, except Utica and Hippo-Dioritis, modern Bizerte, joined the rebellion, becoming bases for the mercenaries and supplying them with resources and manpower. Carthage itself, now besieged by land, saw its supply routes cut, its fields plundered, and its population in panic. The situation was critical. The city, which had just emerged from a devastating war against Rome, now faced a brutal civil war on its own territory, fought by those who had once been its protectors. The savagery of the mercenary war soon became legendary. The rebels, fueled by hatred and vengeance, committed atrocities against Carthaginians who fell into their hands, including the torture and mutilation of prisoners. Carthage, in turn, reacted with equal cruelty, executing captured rebels. The truceless nature of the conflict, the no quarter given, and the brutality on both sides reflected the depth of accumulated resentment. Carthage was on the brink of the abyss, and the future of the once powerful city now depended on its ability to crush this relentless rebellion. The outbreak of the mercenary war plunged Carthage into a state of unprecedented chaos and terror. The city, which had resisted Roman pressure for over 2 decades, now found itself threatened from within by those who had once been its defenders. The mercenary rebellion, united with the uprising of oppressed Libyan populations, transformed the once prosperous Carthaginian hinterland into a desolate battlefield, and the capital itself into a besieged island of despair. The rebels, with their base in Tunes and support from much of the rural territory, established an effective land blockade, cutting off supply routes to Carthage. The city, which relied heavily on agricultural products from its periphery to feed its vast population, immediately faced a shortage of food and resources. Markets emptied, prices soared, and hunger began to set in. Panic spread among the citizens, who feared the invasion and plunder of their metropolis. The terror was not just economic, it was also physical. The mercenary troops and rebel Libyans, fueled by deep hatred and a desire for revenge over unpaid debts and exploitation, acted with shocking brutality. They plundered and burned villages, destroyed crops, and massacred local populations who remained loyal to Carthage or did not join the revolt. The atrocities committed by both sides were such that the conflict became known as the Truceless War by Polybius, the historian. Mercenaries captured by Carthage were cruelly executed, and in retaliation, the rebels retaliated with even more barbaric methods, such as the torture and mutilation of Carthaginian prisoners. The most infamous was the saw method, where prisoners were cut in half. Such accounts, though possibly exaggerated, paint a picture of extreme and uncontrolled violence. Carthage itself, though well fortified, was under constant threat. The rebel forces were not able to take the city by assault due to its massive walls, but they could bombard its gates and keep the population in a state of constant alert. The sound of enemy trumpets and the sight of smoke from burning villages in the distance were a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The Carthaginian elite, accustomed to the luxury and security provided by centuries of maritime dominance, found themselves in a desperate position. Dependence on mercenary armies, once seen as an advantage, now proved to be the greatest weakness. Political leadership was divided and hesitant, with Hanno the Great's faction, which had failed in its initial negotiations, still exerting influence. This internal paralysis only exacerbated the chaos. The mercenary war was not just a military conflict. It was an existential crisis that exposed the deepest fissures in Carthaginian society. Terror, famine, and anarchy threatened to wipe the once great city off the map. Amidst this pandemonium, a voice would rise, a general who, against all odds, would be the only one capable of turning the tide and saving Carthage from annihilation: Hamilcar Barca. At the onset of the mercenary war, command of the Carthaginian forces was entrusted to Hanno the Great, a prominent figure of the Carthaginian oligarchy and leader of the peace faction, who opposed prolonged war with Rome and aggressive territorial expansion. Hanno was a man of vast political experience, known for his conquests in Africa, where he had expanded Carthaginian territory and subjugated Numidian tribes. However, his qualities as an administrator and fiscal negotiator, which made him valuable in peacetime, proved completely inadequate for the brutality and unpredictability of a civil war against revolting mercenaries. Hanno's first major mistake occurred during the negotiations that preceded the revolt. His approach was one of fiscal austerity and inflexibility. Instead of appeasing the mercenaries with promises of full payment, he tried to impose harsher terms on them, arguing that Carthage lacked funds or that the mercenaries had plundered too much. This arrogant and disrespectful stance not only infuriated the soldiers, but also convinced them that they would not be paid. His words were dry, lacking the empathy or understanding of the military mindset that might have averted the outbreak of rebellion. When the revolt did indeed erupt and the mercenaries besieged Carthage, Hanno was appointed general and tasked with crushing the insurrection. However, his ineffectiveness on the battlefield soon became painfully evident. Hanno was a man of slow, methodical tactics, more suited to siege campaigns and pacification against disorganized tribes than to rapid, decisive engagements against experienced and motivated war veterans. His first campaign against the rebels was a disaster. Hanno achieved an initial victory at the Bagrataz River, but his lack of follow-up and inexperience in exploiting success allowed the mercenaries to regroup and surprise him with a counterattack. He lost his camp, his supplies, and much of his troops, suffering a humiliating defeat. Hanno failed to maintain discipline among his own troops and to anticipate the rebels' swift and unpredictable movements. In addition to his tactical shortcomings, Hanno also demonstrated an inability to inspire loyalty or trust in his men. Unlike Hamilcar, he was not a leader who shared dangers or hardships with his troops. His authority stemmed from his political position and wealth, not from his command ability or battlefield charisma. This lack of effective leadership exacerbated the situation, as the Carthaginian troops, already outnumbered, lacked the cohesion or motivation to face the relentless enemy. Hanno's ineffectiveness became so glaring that the Carthaginian people, in desperation, began to clamor for another leader. The city was being strangled, the fields plundered, and its very survival was at stake. It was clear that Hanno was not the right man for the job. His failure to contain the revolt in its early stages allowed it to gain strength and spread, pushing Carthage to the brink of the abyss. Only the intervention of Hamilcar Barca, Hanno's political and military rival, could turn the tide and save the city from certain annihilation. Hamilcar's rise would be, in part, a direct reflection of Hanno's glaring ineptitude in handling the most severe crisis Carthage had ever faced. With Hanno the Great's ineffectiveness and chaos spreading throughout Carthage and its neighboring lands, despair gripped the city. With each defeat, each raid, each report of mercenary cruelty, the Carthaginian populace and civil authorities realized that the current leadership was incapable of saving the metropolis. The army of mercenaries and rebel Libyans, once the city's defenders, were now its tormentors, and the situation demanded a leader of exceptional caliber. All hopes began to converge on a single name, Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar had been the only Carthaginian general to achieve significant successes in the First Punic War, even against overwhelming odds. His ability to sustain resistance in Sicily for years, to operate with minimal resources, and to inflict losses on the Romans was something no other Carthaginian commander had matched. His reputation as a brilliant, indomitable strategist and a leader who inspired loyalty in his troops was unquestionable. Even though the Punic War had been lost, his personal performance was seen as a beacon of competence amidst widespread failure. The popular clamor for Hamilcar was deafening. The people, terrified by hunger, violence, and the imminent destruction of their city, saw in him the only hope for salvation. The streets of Carthage, once bustling with merchants, now echoed with appeals for his return. The fear that the city would fall into the hands of the mercenaries, who would show no mercy, was palpable. In the Council of the Hundred, Carthage's main governing body, Hanno's faction still held sway, but the reality of the situation forced even his political opponents to recognize the need for Hamilcar. It was not a matter of political preference, but of survival. The Senate itself, after deliberation and facing popular pressure and the urgency of the crisis, yielded and formally appointed Hamilcar Barca to command the Carthaginian army tasked with crushing the revolt. Hamilcar's appointment was not without friction. Hanno the Great still held a command, and the coexistence of the two leaders, with their distinct rivalries and methods, would generate tensions. However, the utmost priority was Carthage's survival. Hamilcar accepted the challenge, aware of the task's magnitude. He did not inherit a cohesive and well-supplied army, but a demoralized force largely composed of hastily recruited citizens and newly hired loyal mercenaries, who would have to face a numerous, relentless enemy familiar with Carthaginian tactics. The call to Hamilcar was not merely a military decision. It was an acknowledgement that Carthage needed extraordinary leadership to emerge from an existential crisis. He was the last hope of a city on the brink of collapse, and his acceptance of command marked the beginning of a dramatic turning point in the mercenary war, where his military genius would be tested as never before. From that moment on, Carthage's fate would rest firmly on the shoulders of Hamilcar Barca. Upon assuming command, Hamilcar Barca had no time for lamentations or hesitation. Carthage was besieged, and the mercenary threat was immediate and brutal. His first and most crucial task was to reorganize and revitalize a demoralized army, whose predecessors had failed miserably. Hamilcar's strategy was not based solely on brute force, but on a combination of cunning, discipline, and a deep understanding of his enemy's psychology. Firstly, Hamilcar faced the challenge of gathering and training a new contingent of troops. Unlike most Carthaginian armies, which were predominantly mercenary, Hamilcar's force now included a significant number of Carthaginian citizens who were mobilized to defend their homeland, as well as newly recruited mercenaries who had not yet joined the revolt. Hamilcar knew that for these troops to fight effectively, discipline and cohesion would be paramount. He imposed a rigorous training regimen, boosting the morale and proficiency of his men. The second part of his strategy was mobility and surprise. Hamilcar understood that, although the rebels were numerous and relentless, they were also, for the most part, an irregular force, lacking the discipline and organization of a Roman legion or a professional army. He would avoid large-scale frontal confrontations where numbers might be unfavorable. Instead, he would use the speed of his Numidian cavalry and the cunning of his light infantry to attack enemy weak points, ambush convoys, and surprise isolated units. One of the biggest challenges was the land blockade imposed by the mercenaries. Carthage depended on its supply routes and the rebels had cut them off. Hamilcar needed to secure access to food and other resources. His first major strategic maneuver was the use of the bridge over the Bagradas River. Polybius mentions a bridge crossing the Bagradas River, a key location that allowed access to more fertile areas and supply sources. He used cunning to outflank the mercenary forces, opening a route for Carthage to be resupplied. Hamilcar also exploited internal dissension among the rebels to his advantage. He understood that the alliance between the mercenaries and the Libyans was not unbreakable. He offered amnesty and clemency to those who surrendered and returned to Carthage, promising payment of their overdue wages. This open-door policy aimed to undermine the rebels' unity, encouraging desertions and causing distrust among the rebel leaders, who feared being betrayed. This was a risky tactic but proved effective over time. Furthermore, Hamilcar focused on isolation and siege. He did not attempt to defeat the rebels in a single decisive battle at the outset. Instead, he gradually cornered them, cutting their supply lines and preventing them from receiving reinforcements from their bases in other rebel cities. The goal was to exhaust the mercenaries, forcing them to confront each other without food or resources, and then annihilate them. Hamilcar's strategy against the mercenaries was a testament to his military and political genius. He transformed a disorganized force into a cohesive army, used intelligence and speed to overcome the enemy's superior numbers, and exploited the internal weaknesses of the revolt. His methodical, yet relentless approach would be the key to saving Carthage from almost certain annihilation. Hamilcar Barca's appointment to command quickly yielded results, and his first major victory over the revolting mercenaries occurred at the crucial Battle of the Bagradas River, modern Magerda, which empties near Carthage. This confrontation was not just a military engagement. It was a turning point that restored confidence in Carthage and demonstrated Hamilcar's tactical superiority over the mercenary leadership. After assuming command, Hamilcar faced the immediate challenge of a vast rebel army blocking Carthage. He knew that access to supplies and communications was vital. The Bagradas River, with its crucial bridge providing access to more fertile and secure areas for resupply, was a strategic point. The mercenaries, under the leadership of Spendius and Matho, were well positioned, blocking the main routes and awaiting the Carthaginian attack. Hamilcar's audacity manifested in his strategy. Instead of a predictable frontal assault, he employed an ingenious maneuver. According to Polybius, Hamilcar spotted an opportunity to cross the river at a point where a bridge had been destroyed, but which could still be traversed with some difficulty by his troops. Another, perhaps more likely version, is that he used an existing bridge that the mercenaries considered impassable or did not expect to be used in the way Hamilcar did. He moved his forces at night or with great secrecy, deceiving the rebels about his intentions. When the mercenaries, encamped on the other side of the river, spotted Hamilcar's forces crossing and deploying in open ground, they reacted with ferocity. A contingent of about 10,000 rebels, composed of Gauls, Iberians, and Libyans, rapidly advanced to annihilate the Carthaginian forces, which appeared to be in a vulnerable position. The battle began with the clash of the two infantries. However, Hamilcar had prepared a trap. He used his Numidian cavalry, known for its agility and speed, and his war elephants to flank the mercenaries. While his infantry held the line, the elephants and cavalry attacked the rebels' flanks and rear, causing panic and disorganization. The mercenaries, who expected a direct confrontation, were caught by surprise by Hamilcar's maneuver. Hamilcar's victory was decisive. Many mercenaries were killed, and about 6,000 to 8,000 were captured. The rest fled in disarray. This battle not only inflicted a heavy defeat on the rebels, but also had an immense psychological impact. It demonstrated that Hamilcar was a superior commander to Hanno, and that the Carthaginian army, under his leadership, was still a formidable force. The victory at the Bagradas allowed Hamilcar not only to open supply routes to Carthage, but also to establish a safer base of operations and advance into mercenary-controlled territories. For the first time since the revolt began, the initiative lay with Carthage. The Battle of the Bagradas River marked the beginning of the turning point in the mercenary war, a testament to Hamilcar's ability to turn adversity into opportunity and lead his men to victory against all odds. After the victory at the Bagradas River, Hamilcar Barca did not let the initiative slip from his grasp. He advanced methodically, applying his strategy of isolation and attrition against the mercenaries. The city of Tunis, modern Tunis, which had served as the rebels' main base of operations and headquarters for their leaders, Spendius and Matho, became Hamilcar's next major objective. The siege of Tunis would be a dramatic turning point in the mercenary war. Tunis was a strategic target for several reasons. Its proximity to Carthage made it a constant threat. It was a center for collecting supplies for the rebels, and most importantly, it harbored the revolt's leaders. Taking Tunis would not only be a military blow, but a devastating moral and psychological one for the mercenaries. Hamilcar began the siege of Tunis with his reorganized force, which now included a reinforcing wing under Hanno the Great. Although the relationship between the two remained strained, Hamilcar's siege tactics were relentless. He cut off the city's supply lines, hoping that hunger and disease would do their work. At the same time, he carried out smaller attacks to test the defenses and maintain pressure on the besieged. The mercenaries' morale within Tunis began to decline as resources dwindled and hope for external reinforcements faded. The climax of the siege occurred with the capture of Spendius, one of the main leaders of the revolt, and 10 other rebel generals. Historical tradition, though with nuances, suggests that Hamilcar used a combination of stratagem and negotiation to lure them outside the city walls under the promise of a ceasefire or peace talks. According to Polybius, Spendius and his companions allegedly came out for a conference with Hamilcar, perhaps to discuss terms of surrender or an armistice. However, Hamilcar, invoking a clause from a previous negotiation that allowed Carthaginians to arrest any mercenary leaders who were captured, took them prisoner. This action, though seen as a betrayal by the rebels, was a masterful strategic move for Hamilcar, as it deprived the revolt of its most charismatic and capable leadership. The capture of these leaders had an immediate and paralyzing effect on the remaining mercenaries within Tunis. Matho, the other leader, who was still in the city, attempted a brutal retaliation, crucifying Hamilcar, a Carthaginian general who had been captured earlier, and 30 other Carthaginian nobles in sight of Hamilcar's camp, in a desperate display of defiance. This, however, only served to increase the fury of the Carthaginian troops and Hamilcar's determination to crush the revolt. News of the fall of Tunis and the capture of Spendius spread rapidly among the remaining rebel forces, further undermining their morale. From then on, the mercenary war entered its final phase. The turning point at Tunis demonstrated not only Hamilcar's military capability, but also his tactical coldness and his willingness to use all necessary means to achieve victory. With the enemy leaders in his hands, the end of the truceless war was drawing ever closer. After the victory at the Bagradas River and the siege of Tunis, Hamilcar Barca intensified his strategy of attrition, which the historian Polybius described as a truceless war. Not a pause for peace, but a suspension of pitched battles in favor of a relentless siege, where hunger would become the most potent weapon against the rebels. Hamilcar understood that, although he could win battles, the key to ultimate victory was to cut off the enemy's supplies and force them to surrender through starvation. Hamilcar's siege strategy was multifaceted. First, he worked to isolate the remaining mercenaries in their last strongholds, such as the city of Sicca and the Saw Gap. He systematically cut their supply lines, preventing food, water, and any reinforcements from reaching them. Control of roads and water points became a priority. Second, Hamilcar employed tactics of pursuit and ambush. His forces, especially the Numidian cavalry and light infantry, were constantly dispatched to patrol rebel-controlled areas, intercepting any attempts at foraging or escape. He gave them no respite, forcing them to remain in constant motion, or to take refuge in hard-to-reach locations where resources were scarce. As the siege tightened and supplies ran out, the mercenaries' situation within the besieged areas became desperate. Hunger began to take its toll. The soldiers, once proud and fierce, were now starved, sick, and demoralized. Polybius's accounts are shocking. The mercenaries, in their desperation, resorted to cannibalism, devouring their own dead comrades and even Carthaginian prisoners. This was the terrible reality of Hamilcar's truceless war. A war without large-scale battles, but a war of slow and agonizing destruction. Hamilcar's policy of offering clemency to those who deserted or surrendered also began to take effect. Although the rebel leaders tried to maintain discipline through terror and severe punishment, hunger was a relentless enemy. As conditions worsened, desertions increased, further undermining the mercenaries' strength. Some groups attempted to flee, but were relentlessly pursued and captured by Hamilcar's forces. The culmination of this strategy was the final siege in what became known as the Saw Gap, or Axe Gorge, a difficult-to-access location surrounded by mountains, where the last large rebel contingents had taken refuge. Hamilcar encircled the gorge and, with Hanno's help, who, despite his previous ineffectiveness, still held a command, tightened the siege, completely cutting off access to water and food. The situation within the gorge became unbearable. The mercenaries, reduced to a shadow of their former selves, finally surrendered. Hamilcar's truceless war was a testament to his strategic acumen. He understood that victory is not always achieved through spectacular frontal confrontations, but that patience, discipline, and the ability to exhaust the enemy could be the deadliest weapons. By transforming hunger and siege into his allies, Hamilcar not only broke the mercenary resistance, but also demonstrated a form of warfare that would be emulated by generations of commanders. Hamilcar Barca's relentless strategy, culminating in the truceless war, and the final siege in the Saw Gap, marked the beginning of the end for the brutal mercenary war. In 237 BCE, after 3 years of bloody and devastating conflict, the rebellion that had threatened Carthage's very existence was finally crushed. In the Saw Gap, the last large contingents of mercenaries and rebel Libyans, starving and demoralized, were cornered. The troops of Hamilcar and Hanno, who though rivals collaborated in the final stages of the war, completely encircled the pass, cutting off any hope of escape or supply. Conditions within the gap were unspeakable, with the rebels resorting to extreme acts to survive. Internal disintegration, hunger, and disease claimed more victims than Carthaginian swords. When surrender was the only option, the surviving mercenaries gave themselves up. Hamilcar, who had promised clemency to those who surrendered, in many cases kept his word, integrating some of the deserters and captured mercenaries into his own army. However, for the leaders of the revolt, such as Matho and other generals who had committed atrocities against Carthage, their fate was sealed. Matho was crucified, a brutal punishment reserved for the most heinous criminals in antiquity, and others were executed in equally cruel ways. Carthage's response to the rebellion was ruthless, aiming to send a clear message about the consequences of challenging Punic power. With the total suppression of the revolt, Carthage could finally breathe. The existential threat had been removed. The chaos and destruction that had plagued the Carthaginian hinterland ceased. Slowly, order was restored. The Libyan populations who had joined the revolt were again subjugated, and taxes were reinstated, though perhaps with some initial caution to prevent a new insurrection. The cost of the mercenary war, however, was immense. Thousands of lives were lost, both mercenary and Carthaginian. The city's wealth was further depleted, adding to the heavy war indemnity to Rome. Agricultural lands were devastated, requiring a long period of recovery. The war also exposed the deep internal divisions in Carthaginian politics and the city's vulnerability to a revolt by its own mercenary troops. Despite the high cost, Hamilcar's triumph in the mercenary war elevated him to the status of a national hero. He had saved Carthage from annihilation and restored its dignity. His victory was not merely military, it was a demonstration of political leadership and an unparalleled ability to turn the tide in desperate situations. Hamilcar, the Barca, Lightning, became the most powerful and influential man in Carthage, a savior of the homeland. The end of the mercenary war in 237 BCE marked a new chapter for Carthage. The city had survived, but the scars of war would be deep. The need to rebuild and find new sources of wealth and power would become the priority. And Hamilcar, with his vision of a renewed empire and a deep resentment towards Rome, would lead this new endeavor, seeking the foundation for the next inevitable confrontation. With the mercenary war finally over, and Carthage on the brink of economic and political ruin, Hamilcar Barca emerged not just as a victorious general, but as a statesman with a clear and audacious vision for his city's future. He understood that Carthage's survival lay not only in restoring internal order, but in ensuring its long-term prosperity, and crucially, in strengthening itself against the growing shadow of Rome. For Hamilcar, the humiliation of the First Punic War and the heavy indemnities imposed by Rome demanded a strategic response, the pursuit of new resources and territories. The defeat in the First Punic War had stripped Carthage of its most important sources of wealth in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. The mines and agricultural lands of these islands, which once contributed significantly to the Punic treasury, were now under Roman control. The heavy war indemnity, which Rome insisted on receiving, was a constant drain that prevented Carthage's economic recovery. Hamilcar saw the urgent need to find a new golden goose to finance his city's reconstruction, sustain its army, and perhaps prepare for revenge against Rome. His gaze turned to the Iberian Peninsula, Hispania. Although Carthage already had some trading posts and a certain influence on the southern coast of Hispania, Hamilcar saw the region's untapped potential. Hispania was known for its vast mineral wealth, especially its silver and copper mines, which were coveted throughout the Mediterranean. Furthermore, the peninsula offered fertile lands for agriculture, timber resources for shipbuilding, a pressing need after the naval losses in the First Punic War, and, crucially, an abundant and warlike population that could be recruited to form new armies, reducing the dangerous reliance on disloyal foreign mercenaries. Hamilcar proposed a policy of aggressive and systematic expansion in Hispania. It was not merely about establishing trading posts, but about conquering and colonizing the territory, integrating it into the Carthaginian Empire in a more direct and controlled manner. He planned to create an autonomous power base in Hispania, a kind of new Carthage that could sustain itself and, in the future, challenge Rome. This vision was ambitious and would require not only military prowess, but also diplomatic skills to deal with the Iberian tribes and the Greek colonies already established on the coast. The Carthaginian oligarchy was divided. Hanno the Great's faction, which had suffered a loss of prestige, advocated a more conservative policy, focused on domestic economic recovery and maintaining peace with Rome. They distrusted Hamilcar's ambitions and feared that a new expansion could provoke another war. However, Hamilcar's success in saving Carthage from the mercenary war gave him immense prestige and influence. He managed to secure the necessary support for his venture in Hispania, arguing that the conquest of the peninsula was the only way for Carthage to rise again and ensure its security. Thus, Hamilcar's vision was not just about wealth, it was about the restructuring of Carthaginian power. He wanted a Carthage strong enough never to be humiliated again, a city capable of dictating its own terms in the Mediterranean arena. Hispania, with its resources and human potential, would be the cornerstone of this new empire, a legacy he would begin to build for the future generations of the Barca family. With Carthage breathing a sigh of relief after the suppression of the mercenary war, Hamilcar Barca's keen eye turned westward, across the Mediterranean waters, to the fertile and mineral-rich lands of the Iberian Peninsula, Hispania. This was not a random decision, but the culmination of a deep strategic analysis, a plan not only to raise Carthage from the ashes of Punic defeat, but to prepare it for a future of possible retribution against Rome. Hispania was not an unknown territory to Carthage. Since time immemorial, the Phoenicians and, subsequently, the Carthaginians maintained colonies and trading posts along its southern coasts, exploiting its mineral wealth and establishing commercial relations with the local tribes. However, Hamilcar's vision went far beyond mere commercial exploitation. He aimed at the systematic conquest and integration of large portions of Iberian territory into a new and vast land empire, self-sufficient and militarily strong. The reasons for this choice were multiple and strategic. Inexhaustible mineral wealth. Hispania was legendary for its silver mines, especially those in Baetica, modern Andalusia, in southern Spain. Silver was the currency of the ancient world, and its massive extraction would be the solution to Carthage's financial problems, allowing it to pay the indemnity to Rome, rebuild its infrastructure, and, crucially, finance a new and powerful army. Polybius mentions that the silver mines would be the nervus belli, the sinews of war for Carthage. Abundant natural resources. In addition to silver, Hispania offered fertile agricultural lands, vast forests for shipbuilding, a pressing need after the naval losses in the First Punic War, and other essential natural resources to sustain a war economy. Source of troop recruitment. The Iberian tribes were known for their bravery and skill in combat. By conquering and pacifying these tribes, Carthage could recruit a large number of soldiers for its army, many of them heavy infantry and high-quality cavalry. This would reduce the dangerous dependence on foreign mercenaries and create a more loyal and homogeneous force, directly linked to Carthaginian interests. Distance from Rome. Hispania was far enough from Rome to allow Carthage to build its power without immediate Roman interference. Although Rome had an interest in Hispania, its primary attention was still on Italy and Greece. The distance offered a strategic breathing room for consolidation. Base for the future. Hamilcar did not see Hispania merely as a source of resources, but as an advanced base for future military operations. It was an ideal starting point for any campaign against Rome, especially if the war was waged by land, avoiding Roman naval supremacy. This ambitious vision, though not explicitly stated as an immediate plan for revenge, was a clear harbinger of what was to come. Hamilcar managed to convince the Carthaginian council, overcoming the opposition of Hanno's faction, who preferred to focus on internal recovery and diplomacy with Rome. The prestige he had gained by saving the city from the mercenary war was decisive. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar departed for Hispania, not as a merchant or a diplomat, but as a conqueror, taking with him not only an army, but also the seed of a new empire and the unquenchable flame of a vengeance that would one day burn in his son, Hannibal. The strategic decision to look towards Hispania was the first step on the journey that would lead to the Second Punic War. The year was 237 BCE. Carthage, though saved from internal annihilation, still staggered under the weight of defeats and the humiliation of the First Punic War. Its coffers were empty, its overseas possessions reduced, and its pride wounded. Amidst this scarred landscape, an expedition to a distant new world, the Iberian Peninsula, was being prepared. In command was the man who, alone, had rescued the city from the abyss, Hamilcar Barca. But this was no mere military departure. It was a moment that would seal the fate not only of one family, but of two of the greatest powers of the ancient world. Imagine the scene at the bustling ports of Carthage. The white linen sails hoisted, the oarsmen at their posts, the troops embarking, their faces a mix of hope and uncertainty. Amidst the feverish logistics, Hamilcar Barca, already an imposing and revered figure, prepared to leave. He wouldn't go alone. Beside him, a 9-year-old boy with bright, curious eyes observed the bustle. Hannibal, his eldest son. This journey was more than a simple change of garrison. It was the beginning of a military dynasty, the fulfillment of a promise, perhaps not verbalized at the time, but lived out. Hamilcar, the general who had fought Rome to his last breath in Sicily, harbored a deep hatred for the republic that had humiliated his homeland. He saw in Hispania not just a source of resources, but a training ground, a cradle for the army that one day, he hoped, would avenge Carthage. Taking Hannibal with him on this undertaking was an act of immense symbolic importance. It was the beginning of a future warrior's education, an early immersion in military life, far from the political intrigues of Carthage. Hannibal's presence on that expedition, still in his childhood, is a crucial dramatic hook for the narrative. It allows us to see the beginning of the formation of the greatest enemy Rome would ever know. Young Hannibal would witness firsthand his father's arduous work in building a new empire, the discipline needed to forge an army, the cunning in diplomacy with local tribes, and the ruthlessness in war. He wouldn't just learn military theory, but would live the practice, absorbing every lesson in strategy, leadership, and resilience. It's likely that from a young age, Hamilcar instilled in his son not only the skills of warfare, but also the deep resentment against Rome. Although the famous Oath of Hatred is possibly a later construction or an embellished story, the truth is that Hannibal grew up in an environment where rivalry with Rome was the driving force of the Barca family. The departure for Hispania was, therefore, a seminal moment. It wasn't just a military expedition, it was a sowing. Hamilcar left with the hope of reaping wealth and power in Hispania. But more than that, he carried with him the seed of revenge, cultivated in the heart of his young son, who would one day become the scourge of Rome. The ship leaving Carthage didn't just carry troops and equipment, it carried the future of the Punic War. Among the many stories surrounding the life of Hannibal Barca, few are as powerful and iconic as that of the Oath of Eternal Hatred for Rome. While it is difficult for modern historians to fully confirm the literal truth of this event, it is so deeply embedded in ancient narratives, especially those of Polybius and Livy, that it has become a fundamental pillar for understanding the motivation and trajectory of the legendary Carthaginian general. It's a dramatic moment that, whether it happened exactly as described or not, perfectly captures the essence of the rivalry that would consume Hannibal's life. The story is told by Polybius, who claims to have heard Hannibal's version from his own father, Hamilcar Barca. According to the legend, when Hannibal was still a child, about 9 years old, his father Hamilcar was about to leave for Hispania on his great expedition of conquest. Before embarking, Hamilcar is said to have taken young Hannibal to an altar of sacrifice. There, in a solemn ritual, Hamilcar supposedly asked his son if he would swear never to be a friend of Rome, or even, as some versions interpret, swear eternal hatred for the Romans. Hannibal, still immature but with a mind already shaped by paternal influence, is said to have placed his hand on the altar and uttered the solemn oath, pledging unwavering loyalty to his father and implacable hatred for Carthage's enemies. "When I asked you to come with me to Hispania," Hamilcar is said to have declared, "I asked you if you would swear that you would never be a friend of the Romans. You swore, and I take you with me so that you may fulfill your oath." A variation on Polybius's quote. This scene, rich in symbolism, is crucial to understanding Hannibal's psyche. He didn't grow up with an abstract ambition for glory, but with a personal and familial mission, a sacred duty to avenge the humiliation suffered by Carthage in the First Punic War. His father, who had witnessed the defeat and the imposition of harsh Roman terms, instilled in him a purpose that transcended politics or strategy. It was a matter of honor and destiny. Even if the oath did not occur as a formal event, it is undeniable that Hannibal was raised in an environment where resentment against Rome was pervasive. Hamilcar dedicated his life to rebuilding Carthaginian power in Hispania, with an eye on future confrontation. Hannibal spent his youth and early adulthood on campaigns in Hispania, learning the crafts of war and the politics of the Iberian tribes under the tutelage of his father and then his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal. He saw the Carthaginian Empire being forged and understood the cost of defeat and the necessity of resilience. The legendary oath, therefore, functions as a perfect metaphor for Hannibal's upbringing and motivation. It encapsulates Hamilcar's legacy, who not only gave him life, but also gave him a life's purpose. Regardless of its factual accuracy, the story of the oath resonates with the emotional truth of a rivalry that led to the most epic confrontation of antiquity, with Hannibal becoming the greatest adversary the Roman Republic ever faced. The arrival of Hamilcar Barca in the Iberian Peninsula in 237 BCE marked the beginning of one of the most audacious and successful military campaigns in Carthaginian history. Far from being a mere trading expedition, his mission was to transform what were mere outposts into a vast and lucrative territorial empire. Hamilcar spent the last 9 years of his life, from 237 BCE to 228 BCE, tirelessly dedicating himself to the conquest and consolidation of Carthaginian dominion in Hispania, laying the foundations for Carthage's recovery and, eventually, for the future war against Rome. Hamilcar's campaigns in Hispania were characterized by a combination of military prowess, astute diplomacy, and a keen understanding of the complex tapestry of Iberian tribes. The peninsula was a mosaic of warring peoples: Celtiberians, Iberians, Lusitanians, Turdetani, among others, each with their own rivalries and alliances. Hamilcar did not attempt to subjugate them by brute force in all cases. He knew how to exploit the divisions among the tribes, making alliances with some to subjugate others, and securing loyalty through treaties, strategic marriages, such as his son Hannibal's marriage to an Iberian princess, Emilce, which has not been proven but is widely accepted, and the distribution of wealth. His military strategy was methodical and efficient. He focused on securing control of the coastal areas, which were crucial for the landing of reinforcements and supplies from Carthage, and for the outflow of products from the mines. From these coastal bases, he advanced inland, where silver mines were abundant. The campaigns were often brutal, with pitched battles and sieges of fortified cities. Hamilcar utilized the experience of his veterans from the mercenary war, now loyal to him, and quickly began to incorporate and train contingents of Iberian warriors, who would become a fundamental part of the Barcid army. The main region of interest was Baetica, in southern Hispania, known for its extremely rich silver mines. Silver extraction was accelerated under Carthaginian control, and shipments of this precious metal to Carthage became the main source of financing for the city-state. This wealth allowed Carthage to pay the heavy indemnity to Rome, and at the same time, invest in rebuilding its navy and maintaining a permanent, well-trained army in Hispania. Hamilcar also founded the city of Acre-Loique, modern Alicante or Elche, which served as an important operational base and administrative center. Later, his son-in-law Hasdrubal would found Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, which would become the capital of the Barcid Empire in Hispania. These cities were not just military garrisons. They were economic and political centers that cemented Carthaginian control over the region. The success of Hamilcar's campaigns in Hispania was remarkable. In less than a decade, he transformed a sparse presence into a cohesive, vast, and economically prosperous territorial dominion. He built a formidable army loyal to his family, the Barcids, and generated wealth that Carthage desperately needed. This conquest was not merely a response to the defeat by Rome. It was the creation of a new power, a springboard from which the Barca family, with Hannibal at the helm, would launch its next and most audacious challenge to the Roman Republic. Hispania became the new heart of the Carthaginian Empire, and Hamilcar's legacy there would be the foundation of the Second Punic War. The conquest of the Iberian Peninsula by Hamilcar Barca was not solely driven by territorial ambitions or the desire to recruit troops. The primary engine of this vast undertaking was the incalculable mineral wealth of the region, and above all, its legendary silver mines. In a world where silver was the monetary standard and the sinews of war, control of these mines meant Carthage's economic salvation and the foundation for its military resurgence. Hispania, especially the region known as Baetica, modern Andalusia in southern Spain, was famous since antiquity for its silver deposits. Local tribes, and later the Phoenicians and Greeks, already exploited these resources, but under Carthaginian rule, silver extraction was intensified to an unprecedented scale. Hamilcar and his successors organized mining efficiently and ruthlessly, using slave labor, often sourced from the subjugated Iberian tribes themselves. The flow of silver from Hispania to Carthage had a transformative impact on the Punic economy. Let's remember that, after the First Punic War, Carthage was burdened with an indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver to be paid to Rome in just 10 years, an exorbitant sum that threatened to paralyze the city's economy. Hispanic silver was the solution. It allowed Carthage to meet its financial obligations to Rome, preventing further sanctions or economic disintegration. But the wealth from silver didn't stop there. It also financed the reconstruction and strengthening of Carthage's military power. With resources from the mines, Hamilcar, and subsequently Hasdrubal and Hannibal, were able to pay the troops. Unlike the mercenary crisis, the abundance of silver ensured that new contingents of mercenaries and loyal Iberian troops were paid regularly and well, guaranteeing their loyalty and preventing new internal revolts. Build a new fleet. The naval defeat at the Aegates Islands had decimated the Carthaginian navy. Hispanic silver financed the construction of new and powerful warships, partially restoring Carthage's naval capacity and protecting its trade routes. Invest in infrastructure. New cities were built, such as Carthago Nova, founded by Hasdrubal, which became a vital administrative center and naval base in Hispania, as well as fortresses, roads, and ports, consolidating Carthaginian control over the peninsula. Accumulate resources for war. Silver became the fuel for the Barcid war machine. Hannibal, upon inheriting command in Hispania, would have access to unprecedented wealth, which would allow him to recruit and equip a vast army for his daring invasion of Italy. The logistics of maintaining an army in the field for years, far from its supply bases, would be unthinkable without the constant flow of resources from Hispania. The exploitation of the silver mines was not just an economic activity, it was a pillar of the Barcid strategy for revenge. Hamilcar saw in the mountains of Hispania the path to Carthage's recovery and the creation of a force capable of challenging Rome. Control of these mines transformed Hispania into a private province of the Barca family, a power base that generated the wealth needed to sustain the ambition of a new Punic war. Hispanic silver, therefore, was not just a precious metal. It was the lifeblood that nourished the war machine that would one day march on Rome. One of the greatest contributions of Hamilcar Barca and his successors, Hasdrubal and Hannibal, to Carthaginian military might was the formation of a hybrid army in Hispania. Unlike previous Carthaginian armies, which relied almost exclusively on foreign mercenaries of diverse origins, and, as seen in the Mercenary War, with questionable loyalty, Hamilcar envisioned a more cohesive and effective force. He sought to integrate the valuable qualities of Iberian and Numidian troops with the traditional elements of Carthaginian forces. Hispania, as Hamilcar had predicted, was an inexhaustible source of warriors. The Iberian tribes were famous for their ferocity in combat, their skill with weapons like the falcata, a curved cutting sword, and the gladius hispaniensis, a short sword, precursor to the Roman gladius, and their remarkable resilience. They were experts in mountain warfare and skirmishes, but could also fight in more organized formations. Hamilcar began recruiting these warriors in large numbers, but not merely as disposable mercenaries. He integrated them more deeply into his army, training them in Punic discipline, and in return offering them not only regular pay, guaranteed by Hispanic silver, but also the promise of plunder, prestige, and sometimes even Carthaginian citizenship or special rights. Alliances with tribal chiefs through treaties and mixed marriages, such as Hannibal's supposed marriage to Emilce, an Iberian princess, helped cement the loyalty of these troops. The key components of the Barcid army in Hispania included Iberian infantry. They formed the main body of the infantry, armed with oval shields, scuda, helmets, and the fearsome falcatas and gladii. They were excellent in close combat. Their courage and aggression were legendary. Numidian cavalry. The light cavalry troops from Numidia, North Africa, already an integral part of Carthaginian armies, were maintained and perfected. They were invaluable for reconnaissance, flanking, pursuit, and swift raids. Their ability to operate without saddles or heavy bridles made them incredibly agile. Iberian cavalry. There was also heavy and light Iberian cavalry, which complemented the Numidian. War elephants. Though not recruited locally, African elephants were an iconic and psychologically impactful part of the Carthaginian army, used to break enemy formations and cause panic. Libyan and other mercenary troops. They continued to be recruited, but now with guaranteed pay and under the strong leadership of the Barca family, who enforced strict discipline. The formation of this hybrid army provided Hamilcar and, later, Hannibal with a unique military force. It was flexible, adaptable to different terrains and tactics, and combined Punic discipline with the ferocity and local knowledge of the Iberian warriors. Instead of a mere collection of mercenaries, Hamilcar created a cohesive army loyal to his family and the Carthaginian cause. This force would be the basis for Hannibal's invasion of Italy, a war machine that would surprise Rome with its effectiveness and diversity, and that would represent the greatest military challenge the Roman Republic ever faced. The formation of this hybrid army was, without doubt, one of the greatest strategic achievements of the Barcid dynasty in Hispania. Hamilcar Barca's enterprise in Hispania, initiated in 237 BCE, transcended mere military conquest to become the consolidation of a quasi-autonomous power base for the Barca family in the Iberian Peninsula. Far from Carthage and its political intrigues, Hamilcar and his successors, his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and then his sons Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago, built a true military and economic dynasty, transforming Hispania into a personal and strategic stronghold for the family and a vital resource for Carthage. This autonomy was not official, but it was de facto. The geographical distance and the undisputed success of the Barcids in generating wealth, mainly silver, and maintaining a loyal army, granted them considerable freedom of action. Carthage, still struggling to recover from the war and Roman indemnity, increasingly depended on Hispania's resources, and therefore on the Barcids. This allowed Hamilcar and his successors to make strategic decisions with little direct interference from the Carthaginian Senate. The pillars of this Barcid power were absolute military control. The army in Hispania was not just a Carthaginian army, it was Hamilcar's army, and then Hannibal's. It was composed of veterans of the mercenary war loyal to Hamilcar, Iberian troops recruited and trained under his leadership, and loyal African contingents. Discipline was ironclad, and loyalty was personal. This contrasted sharply with the volatile reliance on mercenaries of previous Carthaginian armies. Mineral wealth. As mentioned earlier, Hispania's silver mines provided a constant flow of capital. This wealth allowed the Barcids to finance their own campaigns, pay their troops regularly, and even send large sums to Carthage, cementing their influence and ensuring the support of factions in the metropolis. Governance and administration. The Barcids were not just generals. They acted as governors and administrators of Hispania. They founded cities such as Carthago Nova, founded by Hasdrubal in 228 BCE, which became the Barcid capital and a strategic naval port, developed infrastructure, and established a system of taxation over the subjugated tribes. This gave them direct control over resources and population, building a solid political and economic base. Network of local alliances. Through a combination of military force, treaties, strategic marriages, and distribution of plunder, the Barcids built a network of alliances with the Iberian tribes. This ensured the security of their routes, the availability of recruits, and intelligence on the movements of hostile or rival tribes. Diplomatic skill. Hasdrubal in particular was known for his diplomatic abilities. He negotiated the famous Treaty of the Ebro with Rome in 226 BCE, which delineated the Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence in Hispania, south and north of the Ebro River respectively. While this treaty was a concession to Rome, it tacitly recognized Barcid dominion south of the river and bought time for the consolidation of their power. The growth of Barcid power in Hispania was not an end in itself, but a means. Hamilcar saw this autonomous base as the springboard for eventual retribution against Rome. He was building not just an empire, but a family war machine, financed and operated by his own dynasty, which would one day be launched against the enemy that had humiliated Carthage. Barcid power in Hispania was the seed from which the greatest challenge to the Roman Republic would sprout. While Hamilcar Barca and his successors efficiently built Carthaginian power in Hispania, Rome watched the Barcids rise with a mixture of apprehension and distrust. Roman legions were busy consolidating control over Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, and dealing with issues in Illyria, eastern Adriatic coast. However, the flow of Hispanic silver to Carthage and the growth of a powerful army under the command of a clearly anti-Roman family could not be ignored. Initially, Rome did not directly intervene in Hispania. There had been a series of earlier treaties regulating spheres of influence between the two powers, but the Barcid expansion in the Iberian Peninsula seemed to disregard these guidelines. The Greek city of Massalia, modern Marseille, an ally of Rome with commercial interests in Hispania, was the first to express concern. Its warnings about the Carthaginian advance along the Iberian coast prompted Rome to pay closer attention to the region. The turning point in these negotiations was the Treaty of the Ebro, signed in 226 BCE between Rome and Hasdrubal the Fair, Hamilcar's son-in-law and successor, who had died in 228 BCE. The core of this treaty was the delimitation of spheres of influence. Carthage committed not to expand its military operations north of the Ebro River in Hispania, and Rome would not interfere in Carthaginian affairs south of the river. The signing of the Treaty of the Ebro was a tacit recognition of Carthaginian dominion south of the river and a respite for the Barcids, who could continue their consolidation without immediate Roman intervention. For Rome, it was a way to contain Carthaginian expansion and protect its Greek allies and some Roman settlements north of the river. However, the treaty was ambiguous and carried within it the seeds of future conflicts. Saguntum, the city of Saguntum, a Greek colony located south of the Ebro River, had established an alliance with Rome even before the signing of the Treaty of the Ebro. The 226 BCE treaty did not explicitly mention Saguntum. This would create a crucial dispute. For Rome, Saguntum was an ally under its protection, regardless of its geographical location. For Carthage, Saguntum was in its sphere of influence, and by forming an alliance with Rome, it was infringing on Punic sovereignty in the region. Divergent interpretation. Interpretations of the treaty differed. Rome saw the treaty as a barrier to Carthaginian expansion and a guarantee for the security of its allies. Carthage, especially the Barca family, saw it as a recognition of their new empire in Hispania, and, at the same time, a limitation that would eventually be challenged. Tensions escalated exponentially in the following years. Hispania's wealth continued to strengthen the Barcids, and the Barcid army under the command of Hannibal, who took command after Hasdrubal's assassination in 221 BCE, became even more formidable. Hannibal, imbued with his father's legacy and the oath of hatred for Rome, had no intention of respecting limits he considered unjustly imposed. The issue of Saguntum became the inevitable spark. When Hannibal decided to besiege and destroy Saguntum in 219 BCE, he knew he was provoking Rome. He argued that Saguntum had violated agreements with Carthage's allied Iberian tribes. Rome, in turn, viewed the attack on Saguntum as a direct violation of the Treaty of the Ebro and an affront to its honor and authority. The final negotiations were tense and fruitless. Rome's response was clear: the demand for Hannibal's surrender. Carthage's refusal would mean war. The negotiations over Hispania, which attempted to postpone the conflict, merely paved the way for the Second Punic War, an inevitable confrontation between two powers with irreconcilable ambitions. Within the strategy of Hamilcar Barca and his successors to consolidate Carthaginian dominion in Hispania, diplomacy and alliances with local tribes were as crucial as military force. The Iberian Peninsula was a mosaic of peoples with their own hierarchies and rivalries, and the Barca family understood that integration through personal ties could be more effective than mere subjugation. It is in this context that Hannibal's supposed marriage to Emilce, a princess from a prominent Iberian family, is set. Although the exact details and historical proof of this marriage are scarce and, at times, divergent in ancient sources, Livy and other historians, the narrative suggests that Hannibal married Emilce, a native of the city of Castulo, modern Caslona, in Andalusia, a rich and strategic city allied with Carthage. Tradition attributes the conception of Hannibal's only known child to this marriage, although the name and fate of this child are largely unknown. Regardless of the precision of the details, the strategic importance of such a marriage would be immense. Cementing alliances, a marriage with a princess from Castulo or any other influential Iberian tribe, would be a seal of alliance. In many ancient cultures, marriage was a form of diplomacy, uniting families and, by extension, peoples. This would create a basis of loyalty and trust between the Barcids and the Iberian elites, ensuring military support, supplies, and intelligence. Cultural and political integration. A mixed marriage signaled Carthage's willingness to integrate the Iberian populations into its empire, rather than simply exploiting them. This could reduce resistance and encourage cultural and political assimilation, making Carthaginian rule more acceptable to the locals. Access to resources and recruits. By strengthening ties with prominent tribes, the Barcids would ensure easier and more stable access to Hispania's valuable resources, including its silver mines, and, crucially, a constant flow of recruits for their army. Iberian warriors known for their bravery would be a vital addition to Hannibal's forces in his future campaign. Legitimacy and leadership. The presence of an Iberian queen and potentially an heir with Punic and Iberian blood could confer greater legitimacy on Barcid leadership over the tribes. Hannibal would not be seen merely as a foreign conqueror, but as someone with kinship ties to the local elites themselves. Example for others. A successful marriage could encourage other Barcid families or Carthaginian officials to do the same, weaving a denser network of alliances through mixed marriages. The figure of Hamilcar, though obscure in history, is a reminder that war was not waged solely with swords and shields, but also with the complex tapestry of diplomacy and personal relationships. Hannibal's marriage, if it indeed occurred as tradition suggests, demonstrates the Barca family's strategic vision in building a cohesive empire in Hispania, where loyalty was as valuable as gold. This base of Iberian support would be invaluable to Hannibal when he embarked on his audacious and almost suicidal journey across the Alps, taking with him an army that, in large part, was composed of these same allies and relatives by marriage. The alliance forged through marriage was one of the many elements that made Hannibal's army such a singular and formidable force. The final years of Hamilcar Barca in the Iberian Peninsula, from 237 BCE until his death in 228 BCE, were marked by an tireless focus on organization and preparation. Far from the direct oversight of the Carthaginian Senate, he operated with remarkable freedom, building a power base that would be fundamental for Carthage's future and for his family's vindication. Hamilcar wasn't just conquering, he was systematizing an empire. His priority was the extraction of wealth. He oversaw the intensification of silver mining, ensuring a constant flow of this precious metal to Carthage, which was vital for paying the indemnity to Rome and for financing his own operations. Hamilcar established an efficient administration to manage the mines, the taxation of subjugated tribes, and the control of trade routes. Hispania became Carthage's treasury, and Hamilcar was its zealous guardian. Military consolidation was another pillar of his final years. Hamilcar continued to expand and train what would become the Barcid army. He not only recruited Iberian warriors, but integrated them into a disciplined system, combining local ferocity with Punic tactics. His experience in the mercenary war taught him the importance of a loyal and well-paid army, and he dedicated himself to ensuring his troops were both. He also built strategic fortresses and military bases to ensure control over conquered areas and to protect the mines. Beyond brute force, Hamilcar demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill. He understood that the total subjugation of all Iberian tribes was unfeasible and unnecessary. Instead, he cultivated alliances with key tribes through treaties, distribution of plunder, and even political marriages. These alliances guaranteed the security of Carthaginian routes, provided recruits, and maintained intelligence on the movements of hostile or rival tribes. He acted as a ruler, not just a military commander. The education of his sons, especially Hannibal, was an intrinsic part of his preparation. Hamilcar not only brought young Hannibal to Hispania, he immersed him in the daily life of military and administrative affairs. Hannibal learned the logistics of campaigns, supply management, combat tactics, diplomacy with natives, and the importance of loyalty. Hamilcar was molding his successor, instilling in him not only skills, but also the vision and purpose of avenging Carthage. Although his death in 228 BCE interrupted his mission, Hamilcar's work in Hispania was monumental. He transformed a sparse presence into a cohesive, economically prosperous, and militarily formidable empire. He created a power base that operated with significant autonomy from Carthage and was completely loyal to his family. Hamilcar had fulfilled his promise to rebuild Carthage's strength, and most importantly, had prepared the ground and shaped the leader for the inevitable confrontation that would follow with Rome. His final years were a testament to his vision, and his unwavering dedication to the Punic cause. The extraordinary career of Hamilcar Barca, the general who had saved Carthage from its greatest internal crisis and planted the seeds of a new empire in Hispania, came to an end in 228 BCE, in a way that befitted his life as a warrior in battle. Although ancient sources offer slightly different accounts of the exact circumstances of his death, the essence is the same. Hamilcar died fighting while consolidating Carthaginian dominion in the Iberian Peninsula. According to the most widely accepted and diffused version, Hamilcar was campaigning in southern Hispania, likely attempting to subjugate or pacify local tribes that resisted Carthaginian expansion. He was besieging the city of Hellas, whose exact location is debated but probably near modern Elche or Alicante, where he had founded Acraloike. During the siege, or perhaps after a skirmish nearby, a local tribe, possibly the Oritani or Vitones, launched a surprise attack or an ambush. Hamilcar, always at the forefront of his troops, was leading his men when he found himself encircled or in a dangerous position. To save his sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago, who were with him and would become prominent generals, or to allow his troops to withdraw, he is said to have performed an act of great bravery and sacrifice. Some accounts suggest he made a desperate final charge, or that he threw himself into a river, possibly the Júcar or Segura, in an attempt to escape and was swept away by the current, or that he was killed in hand-to-hand combat. Polybius, for example, does not detail the exact moment, but mentions that he died fighting heroically. Livy describes an ambush in which Hamilcar, to distract the enemy and protect his forces, led an audacious charge, sacrificing himself to ensure the escape of his men. This image of a commander who puts himself in extreme danger to protect his subordinates is consistent with Hamilcar's reputation as an inspiring and courageous leader. Hamilcar's death was a shock to Carthage and to his army in Hispania. He had been the architect of its recovery and the driving force behind the Iberian expansion. However, his legacy was firmly established. He had left a loyal and well-trained army, a solid economic base, and, most importantly, his sons, who had been molded under his tutelage. After his death, his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, assumed command of the Barcid forces in Hispania, chosen by the officers and ratified by Carthage. Hasdrubal would continue Hamilcar's work, consolidating the conquests and founding Carthago Nova. But Hamilcar's true inheritance was not just territory or gold. It was the spirit of defiance and the burning desire for revenge against Rome, a feeling he had instilled in his son Hannibal from a young age. Hamilcar's death was not an end, but a prelude, paving the way for the rise of the general who would become Rome's greatest adversary. With the death of Hamilcar Barca in 228 BCE, Hispania did not descend into chaos. On the contrary, it saw the consolidation of the power he had built. His son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, assumed command of the Carthaginian forces on the peninsula. Hasdrubal was a leader with a slightly different skill set than his father-in-law. While Hamilcar was a relentless military genius, Hasdrubal was better known for his diplomatic prowess and his ability to forge alliances. He continued Hamilcar's work, but with an approach more focused on negotiation and administration. Under Hasdrubal's command, Barcid Hispania continued to flourish. He consolidated Hamilcar's territorial conquests and expanded Carthaginian influence even further, often through treaties and agreements with the Iberian tribes, rather than pure military force. His greatest contribution was the founding of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, in 228 BCE or soon thereafter. This strategically located port city became the new capital and the main administrative and military center of the Barcid Empire in Hispania. It boasted an excellent harbor, was rich in nearby silver mines, and served as a vital base for both the fleet and the army. The flow of silver from Hispania to Carthage continued unabated, ensuring the economic stability of the metropolis and the regular payment of the Barcid army. This further cemented the Barca family's autonomy in Hispania and their influence over Carthaginian affairs. The anti-Barca faction in Carthage, led by Hanno the Great, though still present, had little capacity to contain the rise of this powerful dynasty. Hasdrubal's great legacy was the Treaty of the Ebro with Rome in 226 BCE. This treaty formally delineated the spheres of influence between the two powers, establishing the Ebro River as the boundary for Carthaginian military expansion to the north. Rome hoped this agreement would contain the Barcid advance and guarantee the security of its allies north of the river. However, the ambiguity surrounding the city of Saguntum, located south of the Ebro but allied with Rome, would become the spark for the next conflict. In 221 BCE, Hasdrubal was assassinated by a Celtic servant, and command of the Barcid army in Hispania passed to Hamilcar's eldest son, Hannibal Barca. At 26 years old, Hannibal was already a battle-hardened veteran, having accompanied his father and brother-in-law on campaigns for nearly 2 decades. He inherited a formidable army, a robust treasury, and a consolidated power base in Hispania. More than that, he inherited his father's oath of hatred for Rome and his unwavering determination. The post-Hamilcar scenario was, therefore, one of an economically reinvigorated Carthage, but with military power increasingly concentrated in the hands of the Barca family in Hispania. Rome, in turn, was attentive, but perhaps underestimated the ambition and genius of the new Carthaginian commander. The Ebro line was a thin frontier, and the issue of Saguntum an open wound. The stage was set for the next and most epic of confrontations between Carthage and Rome, with Hannibal Barca, the heir to Hamilcar's legacy, ready to lead the revenge. Hamilcar's era had ended, but the seed of his ambition would blossom in his son, leading the ancient world to an unprecedented conflict.